Our goal here at EurekaZone is to provide you with smart solutions for your everyday woodworking needs. And that's one of the main reasons behind the development of the EZSMART line of products. Now in this video, I'm going to walk you through the assembly and setup of the EZ-One Woodworking Center. The EZ-One Woodworking Center is the ultimate cutting, routing, and clamping bench designed to be the center of your workshop. Now before we get into the setup, let's cover some of the basics. The EZ-One Woodworking Center comes in 3 separate boxes. Now if you have these boxes shipped to your home, the first thing you want to do is to inspect each box thoroughly and look for any damage that might have occurred during shipping. If you note any damage, you want to write that information down because it will become useful if you have to contact customer service. Now with each EZ-One Woodworking Center, you'll get a set of instructions and within each box a separate packing list for the contents of that box. You want to thoroughly look through all of the contents and match them off to that packing list, and in the unlikely event that something is missing, you want to stop with the installation and contact customer service immediately. Now the EZ-One's assembly is going to be done in 5 stages, starting with the base of the table and working our way up. So let's go ahead and move on to stage 1 and get started to assemble the base. Alright, let's identify the parts for stage 1. You should have a total of 18 parts laid out on your table. We have 2 50-inch SSME side rails, 2 24-inch SSME end rails, 4 SME legs, 2 T-track leg braces, a set of 4 feet, and a set of 4 corners. Now the only tools that are required for the assembly of the base of the EZ-One is a hex key, and we provide this to you in your packaging. The only other tool that you would need is a 1/2-inch nut driver, wrench, or socket. And another helpful tool with the assembly, you might want to go ahead and grab a framing square. It's going to come in useful with squaring up the table as well as squaring up the guide rail at the end of the assembly. Alright, so let's begin by assembling the 2 side rails to the corner frames. Alright, I've gone ahead and set the parts of the base to the side except for the 4 corners and the 2 50-inch SSME side rails. Now I've got the corners laid out on my table in an upside down orientation. And if you notice on each corner there's a series of 3 connectors. One face of the corner has 2 connectors while the other has a single connector. You want the face with the 2 connectors facing to the outside of the table. Once you have everything laid out, you want to take the 6 bolts in each corner and you want to loosen them so that the connectors are floating freely. On the SSME side rails, you'll notice the profile of the extrusion. We have a wide side and a narrow side. The narrow side faces into the table. So we'll go ahead and we'll lay one on this side and we'll turn the other here. Now you want to take your corners, and the connectors are meant to slide right into the channel on the SSME. So you simply just slide it right into position. And then you take your 1/2-inch nut driver or wrench and snug down the 2 bolts for that connector. Don't tighten them down yet because we're going to have to move them for the side rails, but right now the orientation and where they're located is not that important. What's important is that we go ahead and get them into position on all 4 sides. Alright. So now you shouldn't have tightened them down because you should still be able to slide them freely. You want to make sure that they're right on the edge of that SSME so your side rails can slide onto place. So we'll go ahead now and we'll grab our 2 24-inch side rails. And we'll do the same thing. Make sure that the narrow side of the SSME is facing inward, and we'll slide it onto the 4 corners. All right, now the next part is quite important. We want the end rails, the 24-inch end rails, to overlap the 50-inch side rails by halfway. So let me reiterate this again. We want the end rail to overlap the side rail by halfway. In that orientation there. So that way you have clearance to slide connectors and everything in here. Once you have that in position, go ahead and secure all 4 of the connector bolts. Once all 4 of the connectors are secured all the way around the table frame, you're ready to go ahead and install the legs. The legs are your 34-inch SME. Now on the SME, you'll notice that you'll have one side that has a channel and the other side is clear. The channel is facing in and slides right on to the connector. Once it slides on, it sits perfectly right down onto that lip on the inside of that SSME side rail. Go ahead and slide all 4 of the legs on. And secure the 2 bolts in each corner that hold the connector that is slid into the leg. Alright, once the 4 legs are firmly secured to the corner brackets, all we have to do now is put on our 2 leg braces and our 4 feet, then we'll be able to flip the base over upright onto the floor off of our workbench for the rest of the assembly. Now the 2 leg braces are your 23 3/4 inch T-tracks. And in each end of the T-track, the hardware is already installed. You should have a total of 2 button head screws, 2 washers, and 2 inserts on the back side for each of the leg braces. If you notice on the profile of the T-track, there is a lip. You want that lip facing down because the table is upside down, and that lip acts as a place to hold a shelf if you ever want to put an auxiliary shelf on your EZ-One Woodworking Center at some point. The inserts are meant to slide in the 2 outside grooves on the legs. So all you have to do is simply just insert the insert into that groove on both sides. And you want to position the bracket about 6 to 8 inches from the bottom of the leg. And to secure the leg braces, all you need is the hex key that is provided to you in the packaging. You can go ahead and just secure them firmly right now. You don't need to tighten them down all the way because we want to go ahead and square up the leg brackets so they are nice and square with the legs. We can do that once we get the table turned up on its upright position. Okay, with the leg braces installed, all we have to do now is install the 4 feet on each leg. And on the 4 feet, the hardware is already included, has a connector and a screw, and you want that connector to slide right into the groove of each leg until it rests firmly against the bottom of the leg. Now these feet are perfect for adjustments if you have an uneven floor in your workshop. A great way to level out the table is to adjust the feet accordingly so it sits nice and flat on your surface. But for now, we'll go ahead and rest them firmly on the bottom of the leg, and we'll make the adjustments if necessary at a later stage. All right, with all 4 feet installed on the legs, that completes stage 1 of the assembly. We can now go ahead and take the base and flip it upright off of our workbench and onto the floor to begin stage 2. All right, we're ready to begin stage 2 of the assembly, and the only tool required is either a 1/2 inch wrench or a crescent wrench like I'm using. Now at this point you should have already identified the 16 parts required for stage 2 within the assembly instructions, and I've got them laid out here, and what you're looking for is a 48-inch SSME extrusion and two 42-inch SSME extrusions. The top extrusions are easily identified by the pre-cut kerf already in them. You're looking for a total of 6 sliding brackets, 3 left and 3 right, and a total of 6 sliding bracket connectors, 1.5-inch connector with a washer and a black 3-star knob, and a squaring rod, and the squaring rod also has its hardware pre-installed for you. Now on the sliding brackets, you'll notice that we've already got a knob and a nut pre-installed for you and a pre-drilled hole. What you want to do is you want to take that connector, you want to remove that 3-star knob and the washer from the connector, and you want to install it through the hole from the top down, and then go ahead and flip it over, reinstall your washer and your 3-star knob. Don't secure the 3-star knob down just yet, because you want that connector to be able to move freely. Now when it comes to determining which is the left and which is the right of the sliding brackets, once you have your connectors in all 6 of the sliding brackets, the connectors are going to be facing to the outside of the side of the tables. On the leading side of the table that's closest, the end that's closest to me, this is my leading side here, and the side that's farthest from me, that's going to be the end of my table. You want, on the leading side of the table, you want those black knobs that are already installed on the top of the sliding brackets, you want them facing towards the end of the table, furthest away from you, on both the front SSME and the center SSME. On the third SSME at the far end of the table, you want that black knob facing furthest from that end of the table towards you. Alright, to install the sliding brackets, what you want to do is you want to loosen up that black knob that's already at the top of the sliding bracket. Loosen it up so you have some movement in there, and go ahead and take off the nut and slide the nut into the top groove on the side rails of the table base. Okay, go ahead and slide that nut in, and then bring the sliding bracket. You'll see a groove in the bottom side of it. It fits right over that lip of the side rail. Go ahead and bring that right over until you are able to screw that knob right back into that nut. All right, do that for both sides of your sliding brackets, and then we'll move and get the center bracket and the end brackets installed from the other end of the table. Alright, I went ahead and removed the parts from the top of the table so I could work with the table, and I've got 2 of my sliding brackets installed on one end of the table, and I've got my 48-inch SSME. Now if you notice on the 48-inch SSME and all the SSMEs for the top rail, you're going to have, from the kerf cut to one end, you're going to have a short end, and then you'll have a long end to the kerf cut. You want that short side to be from the left side of the table to the kerf cut if you're using a right-handed blade circular saw, and you want it from the right side of the table to the kerf cut, the short side, if you're using a left-handed blade circular saw. Now I'm using a right-handed blade circular saw, so I want my short side from the kerf cut to be facing the left side of the table. Now what you want to do is, again, on the profile of the SSME, you've got your wide face and you've got your narrow face with the kerf cut in the top. That wide face is down, of course, and the groove in the bottom of that SSME slides right over the connectors that are in the top of the sliding brackets. So you want to go ahead and just make sure that that connector is loose enough that it can slide right in one side, right into the other. Now what you want to do is you want to make sure that the end of the SSME is flush with the side of the bracket. It's going to be your reference for aligning your kerf cuts. So go ahead and flush that up nicely. You can secure down the 3-star knob at the bottom on both sides. and loosen up your top black knobs, and you should be able to slide that SSME and those sliding brackets freely. All right, what we want to do is now, before we put on the other sliding brackets and the other SSME extrusions, we want to go ahead and install the squaring rod for the table. And by having the one SSME and sliding brackets on, it's going to allow us to slide from one end of the table to make sure our table is nice and squared up and get our squaring rod installed. Now the squaring rod already comes with the hardware pre-installed, so what you want to do is you want to remove that hardware, and on the far end of the table is where I like to put my squaring rod. You can put it on any corner of the table that you desire, but I like mine on the far end of the table here, so I'm going to place mine right about there. So what I want to do is, with the 2 bolts that came out of the squaring rod, I'm going to slide one into the bottom groove of the side rail, and one of those bolts I'm going to slide into the groove in the bottom of the end rail. Position those, and I'm going to take my SSME extrusion, my sliding brackets, I'm going to make sure that they slide freely from one end of the table to the other with no resistance. If everything is fine, then that means I have really lined up my table well during the assembly of the base in stage 1. So now that I have that confirmed, that my table is, nice and squared up and parallel, my sides are true, I can go ahead and install my squaring rod. Just slide the squaring rod over the nut, install one washer and one nut on one end, and on the other end do the same thing. All right, now you want to apply pressure to make sure that it's nice. You've got some nice firm hold on that squaring rod there, and it's pulling those corners into one another in a 90-degree position. And you take your 1/2-inch wrench or your crescent wrench and go ahead and secure that squaring rod into place. There we go. So now that we've got the squaring rod in, we can go ahead and bring the 48-inch SSME back down to the leading end of the table. Now this is going to be positioned at the leading end of the table, and it's always going to stay in that position. So we'll go ahead and slide it back down. And you want to slide it down until those brackets stop against the side rail. And then go ahead and secure them sliding brackets down so that doesn't move. Now, from the far end of the table, we can go ahead and install the other 4 sliding brackets and the 2 42-inch SSMEs. Again, we're removing the nut. We're going to slide that nut into the top groove of the side rails. We're going to drop down the sliding bracket right on the side rail. It snaps on there nicely. It's got a nice fit right over that nut, and we're going to secure it. Again, remember, when you're installing the sliding brackets, make sure that the connectors on the sliding brackets are facing out. And as I said, on this first sliding bracket here in the center, you want these black knobs facing away from you. If you're standing on the side of the table looking at the end of the table, you want them facing away. And on this sliding bracket, on the very last one, you want that black knob facing inward. All right? So we'll go ahead and move around the table, get all the brackets on. All right. So now, once you have all 6 of the brackets installed, and the last 4 that we're working on now, let's go ahead and get them installed. Make sure that your connectors are floating loosely so you can slide those extrusions right on. There we go. Nicely. Bring my 2 extrusions back over here. And again, I'm working with a right-handed blade skill saw, so my short side to my curve cut is going to be on the left side of my table. So we'll go ahead and slide that in. There we go. Loosen that up a little bit more. Sometimes you might drop a knob. It's all right. Get that in there. Let me bend down and pick this up. There we go. There we go. Again, remember, when installing the extrusions, you want the end of that extrusion flush with that sliding bracket. So go ahead and slide it in position. Make sure you're nice and flush, and then secure it in place. All right, loosen these up. Make sure we've got nice movement, nice glide. Very good. And we'll put the last one in. Loosen that up a little bit, and there we go. Flush it up. All right, nicely done. Once you've got those all secured on there, and you make sure that everything slides freely, you are finished with stage 2 of the assembly, and we can move on to stage 3. All right, we're ready to begin stage 3 of the assembly, which is installing the depth gauge and the B300 bridge kit onto your EZ-One Woodworking Center. Now, the only tools required for stage 3 is a Phillips screwdriver and a crescent wrench. Now, you should have already identified the 6 parts required for the stage 3 assembly within the assembly instructions. What you're looking for is the depth gauge, which is easily identifiable by the large 5-star black knob, as well as the B300 bridge kit and the B300 bridge kit handle, 2 832 by 1.5 inch screws, their washers, and the locking nuts, and those come together in a hardware bag for you. We're going to go ahead and we'll set one side of the bridge kit and the depth gauge. We're going to set that aside for a minute, and we're going to start by installing the handle onto the main arm of the B300 bridge kit, and that's easily identifiable by the 2 orange arms. What you want to do is you just want to snap that handle right into the groove and line up your holes. Now you can take and drop your 832 screws in right through, and then install your washer and your locking nuts. Very nice. Once you've got the handle installed, go ahead and set this aside because we're going to start with the other end of the B300 bridge kit. And the other end of the B300 bridge kit looks like this. You've got 2 silver arms, and then you've got your small 90-degree bracket and your guide rail rest up here. So what we want to do is there are 2 connectors on the lower side of this bridge assembly, and you want to loosen those up so they float freely, and they slide right in to the channel on your end rails here. So we'll go ahead. You want to make sure that the 90 degree of the main body of the bracket is facing outward. Okay, just like that. So go ahead and slide those connectors in. Just like that. All right. Now, we want to take, you can use either a crescent wrench, like I said, or if you still happen to have your 1/2 inch wrench or your nut driver handy, you can go ahead and use that for securing the bridges in place. I'm going to use my crescent wrench since I have it handy. And what we're looking for, I'm going to drop this arm down and the top of the main bracket here, I want that top flush with the top of my SSME end rail. So I'm going to bring that up till it's flush, and then I'm going to secure my nuts and those connectors in place. Don't tighten them down just yet because we still have to position the bridge, and I'll talk to you about that in just 1 second. We'll just go ahead and get it secured so it's held nicely in place before we tighten it down all the way. Now remember, if you're using a right-handed blade circular saw like I'm using, you want to make sure that the bridge and the guide rail line up with that kerf cut from the left side of the table. And again, if you're using a left-handed blade skill saw, your extrusions are going to be slid over to the extreme right, so that bridge would be positioned more so to the right side of the table, so it lines up with that kerf cut nicely. So I need to be over here, and what I'm looking for in both directions, no matter what circular saw you're using, from the end of that end rail, you want to be in 7 inches to the side of your bridge bracket. Okay, so 7 inches in to the side of that bridge bracket. So I'm going to grab my tape measure here. Just like you in your shop, you should always have a tape measure handy. And I'm going to take and I'm going to measure that 7 inches to the end. And when I'm in position, I'm going to go ahead and make sure that the top of my bracket is still flush with the top of my end rail. And I'm going to secure those nuts down firmly. There we go. Just a couple of turns and you'll be set. All right, so now the arm can just float. It doesn't need to be any special position right at this time. We'll worry about that when we go ahead and install the guide rail. So what we're going to do now, and the great thing about the EZ-One table, it's a robust, solid table, but it's a lightweight table. So all I have to do is just spin it around, and on those feet, it slides really nicely. So we're going to turn it around so you can see the other end of the table here. And now we're going to install the other end of the bridge. Now the other end of the bridge, same thing. You've got 2 connectors on the back side. You want to go ahead and loosen them up so they float nicely, and they will slide in to the SSME ends just like the other side. Get that one in there, line up the second one, and slide it into place. All right, same thing again. We want to make sure that our top of our bracket here, the top of our bracket is flush with our end rail. And we want to make sure that we are, once again, 7 inches, and I got to be on this side because I turned the table around. So we want to be 7 inches from the side of the table to the side of the bracket. So on your end rail here, the side of your end rail, not the side of the table like I just said, but the end rail, 7 inches in. So we'll go ahead and get that measurement. There we go. And we will once again secure that into place. Very nice. We'll go ahead and double check, make sure that the bridge didn't move, make sure I got my 7 inches. I do. Now I can secure that firmly in place. There we go. So now we are ready to go. We've got that installed. Now what we want to do is we want to install the depth gauge. The depth gauge is, remember this piece with the large 5-star black knob. Now the depth gauge slides into the end rail of the SSME of the table right next to the bridge, the B300 bridge kit. And you'll notice that there's a groove on the back side of the depth gauge with a connector. You'll notice that you've got a channel here that wraps right around this SSME end rail. And you want the thick, tall part. It's about 1.5 inches part right here. And then you'll see it's just smaller there. It's about 1/2 inch there. You want that wide part facing upward. So we'll go ahead and orientate this to this side for me. And just so you know what I'm doing here, the depth gauge will be on the right side of your bridge. If I'm using my bridge this way and my guide rails here, I want my depth gauge here because I'm going to be cutting on this side of the table. So we'll go ahead and we'll slide that in there, loosen that up, get my connector in position. Perfect. Slide that right into place. All right, once I get that positioned, I'll go ahead and just secure that down, but we'll reposition it once we get the guide rail on. So now that you have your depth gauge on, you are finished with stage 3 and ready to move on to stage 4, which is installing the guide rail. All right, we're ready to begin stage 4 of the assembly, which is installing the guide rail onto the B300 bridge kit of the EZ-One Woodworking Center. Now the only tools required for stage 4 is either a 1/2-inch wrench or a crescent wrench. I'm going to use a 1/2-inch wrench on this. I find it a lot easier to get access to the nuts on the bottom side of the bridge. Now in stage 4 you should have already identified the 5 parts required for the assembly in your assembly instructions. What you're looking for is your 72-inch guide rail, your track, your 2 anti-chip edges, and 2 nuts, bolts, and washers, 1/4-20 nuts, bolts, and washers. Now, the 2 1/4-20 nuts, bolts, and washers are only to be used if you are planning to use a guide rail on your EZ-One Woodworking Center that is not our own. If you're using any of the competitors such as Makita, Festool, or DeWalt, you can go ahead and do that and utilize the hardware that we provide to you. When you're installing that, you'll notice on the B300 bridge kit, you'll notice this slot right here. This is the slot used for the assembly or the installation of another track or another guide rail that's not our own onto the B300 bridge kit. That's the slot you use, and that's where your hardware goes into. All right, we're going to focus on installing our guide rail onto the EZ-One. And the first thing you want to do is you want to go ahead and install your anti-chip edges into the sides of the guide rail. So we'll go ahead and we'll do that now. We'll simply just slide it right in the full length of the guide rail. All right, on both sides. The anti-chip edge slides right into the channels on the sides of the guide rail, and the great thing about that is it's easily removable. If you ever have to change your anti-chip edges for any reason, you can just slide them in and out, no problem. All right, once you have your anti-chip edges installed in the guide rail, before installing the guide rail onto the B300 bridge kit, you want to go ahead and prepare the cut side of the anti-chip edge of the guide rail that you're going to use, depending on whether you have a left-handed blade saw or a right-handed blade saw. You're going to prepare the anti-chip edge associated with that side. The best way to do that is on a workbench, a separate workbench off of the EZ-One Woodworking Center, and you can follow the instructions in the track saw assembly and setup video. You'll find the link to that video right here. It'll take you right to the part that talks about preparing the anti-chip edge before installing it onto the bridge. All right, so we've already went ahead and we've prepared our anti-chip edge, and we're ready to go ahead and install it onto the bridge kit. You'll notice there's 4 connectors on each end of the bridge kit, and you'll notice that one connector is longer than the other. That is for the ease of installation. The connectors are designed to slide right into the 2 channels on the bottom side of the guide rail, and that longer connector goes in first, and it allows you to quickly and easily line up that shorter connector so you can slide it right on with no problem. So the first thing we're going to do is I'm going to set my guide rail up on the lead side bridge handle, and I'm going to go ahead and install the connectors into this end, slide it into place, and then I'm going to move down to the other end of the table and do the same thing at this end. Long connector first and the short connector, slide it right on. So now that your guide rail is on, we need to go ahead and set it in the proper position. So what we want to do, there's a couple of ways you can do this, but I'm going to walk you through the easiest and quickest way to set up your bridge and your guide rail. You want to make sure that from the end of the guide rail here, and we're working on the far end of the table, got our handle for our bridge down at that end of the table. From here, from the end of the guide rail into the connectors and this block right here, you want to be about 4 inches from the end of the guide rail. That's a good place for it. So when you're in your position there, go ahead and secure those 2 nuts and those 2 connectors. There we go. And firm those down. That way the guide rail doesn't slide on this end of the bridge. You want it to slide on the other end for the setup here. So I've got that locked down nice and firm. It's not going to move on there. And what I want to look at, what I want to make sure of, is that my guide rail is laying flat across all of my top rails here, all of my top sliding rails. I want my guide rail to lay nice and flat all the way down. Once I've got that flat, that tells me where the position of my bridge needs to be down here. And the reason I use a 1/2 inch box wrench is it gives me easy access to the 2 bolts on the bottom side of this bridge that secure the guide rail in place. So it's just for ease of access. So I'm looking down my guide rail here and it's laying flat all the way across the table. Everything looks good. I can go ahead and secure those bolts in place and lock that bridge down, the guide rail down to the bridge. All right. So we'll do both sides here. And you want to go ahead at this point and you want to secure it down firmly. All right, and that takes care of stage 4 of the assembly process. All right, we're ready to begin the 5th and final stage of the assembly of the EZ-One Woodworking Center. And at this point, you should have already identified the remaining parts, which is your 7-stop kit, as well as your universal saw base kit. Now within the universal saw base kit, you will find the main body of the saw base, your fin insert, your fin, 1 off-rail insert, and 2 on-rail inserts, a left and a right, as well as the mounting hardware. It's all included in the kit. And on your 7-stop kit, you will have a 1 X limit stop, 2 of your sliding cross stops, and 4 of your aluminum 6-way stops. Now we'll talk about the 7-stop kit in just a minute, but first I want to go over the mounting of the universal saw base onto your circular saw. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to set this 7-stop kit aside for a moment. Get it over here. And on your universal saw base kit, when mounting it to your circular saw, what you want to do is you want to click this link. This link will take you to the assembly video. Follow the procedures within the video for the mounting of the universal saw base to your circular saw. And once you're done mounting it to your circular saw, then you can continue with the final setup of the EZ-One Woodworking Center. So we've already went ahead and mounted a saw base to our circular saw, so I'm going to set this aside. And I'm going to grab my circular saw here that's already got the universal saw base mounted onto it, and I'm going to set it right up here on the guide rail. Now once you have the base mounted to your circular saw, you're going to use that to do some final checks on your table to make sure that everything is in its appropriate orientation and line. The first thing you're going to check is the kerf. You remember the pre-cut kerf on your top rails. You want to make sure that your bridge is in perfect alignment with that kerf. So what you're going to do, exactly what I'm going to do here, is I'm going to drop my saw down so my blade is within that kerf. And then you want to take your saw and you want to run it from one end of the guide rail to the other and make sure that the blade travels within that kerf, those pre-cut kerfs, so that they're not binding or anything. So we'll just run that down, and if you find that your kerf is out of alignment from your guide rail, you can go ahead and make that adjustment. You can either make the adjustment by adjusting the bridge and the guide rail to one side or the other, or you can just lightly adjust your SSMEs, whichever way you seem fit. Both of them work well. I recommend adjusting the bridge and the guide rail, so that way you always have your reference point on the SSMEs up against those sliding brackets. All right, so now that we know that our kerf is in line with our guide rail, I want to talk to you about the depth stop that we installed in stage 3. Now the depth stop, the main purpose of that depth stop is to tell you how low to go for your cut, how low to set your saw when you're getting ready to cut your material. So if you can see here, you should have a good view there. When you raise your bridge up and you place your material under the guide rail and you drop that bridge down on top of your material, you want to bring your saw up to that depth stop. Now that depth stop, we didn't position it properly. You want to go ahead and loosen it and bring it right up under your blade now that you've got your saw on top of the guide rail, so that way it's right up over there. And what that does is now I can take my saw and I can bring the center of that blade, I can bring the tooth right down to the top of that depth stop and lock my saw into position. That tells me how far I need to go, because you only need to cut through your material and slightly below your material and everything, and so that depth stop is set there for you. Every once in a while you might cut through it a little bit. Don't worry about that. You can just slide your depth stop over if you need to. But I've got my depth set. I'm good to go all the way down. And that is the final, just double checking and everything to set up to make sure that your guide rail and your kerf cuts and your saws all play nicely together. All right, so what we're going to do now is I'm going to take my saw and set it aside for a moment. We're going to talk about the 7-stop kit. Now the 7-stop kit is a very useful stop kit for any of your woodworking tasks that you do on the EZ-One Woodworking Center. And we'll talk about, first off, the sliding cross stops. Now you have 2 sliding cross stops. They're about 15 inches long, and you can identify them by the 2 black screws, threaded screws on the top there. The sliding cross stops slide right into the top groove of your top rails here, and I like to put one on this side as well. And I'll raise my bridge up a little bit and slide that under, right up to the, there we go, about halfway under the guide rail. And you just turn that knob to lock that stop into place on both sides. And I like to bring this stop right up to the outside of my kerf cut, and just turn those knobs again, lock it right in place. Now the sliding cross stops will move from one of the guide rails, the top rails, to the other, depending on the type of cut you're making. If you're working with large sheet goods that lay across the table, then you want your sliding cross stops in this 48-inch SSME that's closest to the bridge. Now, once again, to remind you from earlier in the video, this rail here, this SSME top sliding rail, does not move from this position. It stays in this position. That's your reference. What you do is when you bring your material in, you reference that material right up against that stop and drop your bridge down on top of the material and make your cut. This is a way to square up your guide rail with your sliding rail here to make sure that you're always making true and square cuts. Now when it comes to doing that, what you want to do is, and this is what I talked to you about earlier in the video, I said a handy tool to have for the assembly is a framing square. I'm going to use the framing square to square my guide rail up with my top sliding rail here. So we'll go ahead and what I'm going to do is I'm going to move my anti-chip edge out of the way, and then I'm going to take my framing square. I'm going to put it right up against my sliding stop here, and I'm going to bring it up to the side of my guide rail and make sure that everything is nice and square. That way I'm assured to get square cuts. So we'll go ahead and do that now, and let me take and move my anti-chip edge out of the way for a moment. And that's the great thing about this anti-chip edge. It slides right in and out of the guide rail just for this purpose. So, well, not just for this purpose, but it's a great thing that just easy setup. So what we got is I got my sliding cross stop locked into position, framing square up against it. Can bring it right up to my guide rail, and look at that. Nice, true square, and that's a way to know that when you reference your wood up to that stop, you're going to get a square cut. All right, so now that I'm all square there, you know, it's hip to be square. All right, so now I can go ahead and I can slide my anti-chip edge right in, once again, into that guide rail. All right, now talk to you about the sliding cross stops in this position if you're working with large sheet goods. But what happens if you're working with a smaller piece of wood, you know, maybe, you know, a small board or, you know, a small piece of plywood? Well, you want, because, you know, when you're working with your saw, and I'm going to leave my saw over there right now, I'm going to kind of motion it by hand. When you're working with your saw, you know, you're pushing in that direction. Well, when you're working with large sheets, they're firm, they're straight. You know, the guide rail is clamped down, so it's not going to move because of the weight. But on the smaller pieces, you want to take your sliding cross stops, you want to bring them over here to your middle SSME or even your end, depending on, you know, where you want to cut. Go ahead and lock that one down. We'll bring this here. And I happen to have a piece of wood that I can bring in here just to, you know, for dramatization purposes. We'll go ahead and bring that bridge up, and let me step here. All right, now I got to rip this small piece of plywood here. Well, what I want to do is I want to, first of all, look at my length, make sure that my piece of wood can rest on the top of my SSMEs, and I want to give myself just a little bit more room. So what I'm going to do is, it's the great thing about this open top design, look at that. I can slide that guide right into place and lock it down. All right, so now I'm going to take my wood and I'm going to reference it right up against that sliding cross stop, and underneath my guide rail, my cut line, which I'm sure I would have already had marked out there, drop my bridge down, and now when I'm cutting into this piece, it's putting pressure up against this sliding cross stop, and you know you're safe. That piece isn't going to go anywhere. It's not going to move at all. So that is one of the reasons for the sliding cross stops, you know, to move them in different positions depending on what you're cutting. All right, so let's talk a little bit about the small 6-way stops. You should have 4 of them. These small 6-way stops, great little stop. They're great for setting stops for ripping, cross-cutting, as well as pinning you know, small parts onto the table so they don't move. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to move my sliding cross stops back to their position here. This is kind of my resting position when I keep my sliding cross stops in my main 48-inch SSME. All right. Now, let's say I want to rip, you know, 3-inch strips out of a sheet of plywood, or I just want to do some ripping and I want to do some consecutive ripping. Well, I'm going to use my 6-way stops as, you know, as a reference point, so I can just keep on ripping without stopping. So I'm going to take my small stop here, and you see the design of that? There's some notches in here. That's great for pinning materials, but also you can use the edge of it for referencing. So I'm going to slide this into here. And what I would end up doing is from my guide rail to the end of my stop, I would measure to make sure I had my 3 inches if that's the size strips I want to rip. And lock that into place. And depending on how long my workpiece is, if I needed another stop on the far end of the table, I would do that as well. But all I need is that one stop there. The other stops, great storage all around the table. All of these grooves and everything slides within one another. You could just slide those right into that channel on the SSME, your frame, for onboard storage. Or even on the bottom side of your SSME rail here, you can just slide them right in, and you've got your onboard storage for all of your stops right there and there, so you don't have to worry about losing them anywhere. All right, so I've got one stop there, and now I'm going to introduce you to the X limit stop. The X limit stop is great. It works with the long sliding cross stops that we talked about earlier. And what you do is, there's a groove in the bottom of this. You snap it right onto that sliding cross stop, just like that. And there is the hex key that was provided to you that you use during the assembly. You use that to lock that sliding cross stop, or that X limit stop, onto your sliding cross stop. So what I would do, same thing, I would measure to make sure that I had from my end of my guide rail to my sliding cross stop, make sure I had 3 inches, same as this, and now I can reference my material. I can grab my board, slide it up, bring it right up to those stops, slide that guide rail down, and then I can make my cuts and everything. And I can repeat those cuts because those stops are in a fixed position. So I wouldn't rip this 3-inch board down to 3 inches. It's already ripped to 3 inches. All right, so now that's one use of the 6-way stop. Another use of the 6-way stop, we can grab one of the other ones here, and we can slide it in. And now I've got 2 corners here on these sliding cross stops that I can actually pin a board right in there and lock them down. If I ever needed to do any routing or any other procedures and everything, I got a way to lock some wood down on the table. There's so many uses. You're only limited by your imagination of what you can do with these stops. If you're setting up angled cuts or tapered cuts, you can use the stops for those various configurations. So just let your mind wander, and you'll be amazed at what you can do with this table and the open top design and everything. All right, now one of the other things I want to talk to you about is bevel cutting on the EZ-One Woodworking Center, and the use of the X limit stop here to help you or assist you with your bevel cutting. When you're bevel cutting on the EZ-One Woodworking Center, we've already got our 90-degree kerf in here. Depending on what angle you're going to be making your bevel cuts on, you may need to be required to cut an additional kerf in here, but don't be afraid. That is exactly what this SSME extrusion is designed for. You can cut through this. Because of this table's configurations and the ability to move this table in all different directions, parallel, perpendicular, you can cut kerfs in here, and that's what it's made for, and it doesn't hurt the carbide of the teeth of your blade. So when you're doing bevel cuts, you want to use the X limit stop as exactly what it is, a stop, and that groove on the bottom of it allows you to snap it right on to the guide rail as well. That limits your X travel, your X-axis travel. And what you want to do is, because of the arms of the bridge, you have to start your bevel cuts, because when you bevel your saw, your blade is turning in underneath the guide rail. You do not want to cut into those bridge arms. That could really not be a good day. So what you want to do is you want to lay your saw. Let's go ahead and grab this saw, and I'll give you an example. The bottom of the saw base, so there's 2 grooves. It's very important. The inside groove that's closest to the blade, that is for your 90-degree cuts. The outside groove that's furthest away from the back side of the blade, that is for any of your angle cuts other than 90 degrees. All right? So since we're going to do a bevel cut, we're going to place this groove onto the center ridge of the guide rail. So we've got that onto the center ridge of the guide rail. So when you come back, it stops your saw from going back too far. That way your blade does not come in contact with the bridge arm. All right? You want to use that as a reference. That way, when you're making your cut, it stops you from coming back too far so you don't cut into your arms, okay? Very important, and it's something you should always do when making bevel cuts on the EZ-One Woodworking Center. To learn more about your stops and how to use them, you can check out some of the how-to videos within the EurekaZone.com website by checking this link here, www.EurekaZone.com. All right, guys, well, that is the final stages and setup of the EZ-One Woodworking Center. You're ready to go and start cutting. Make some sawdust. Happy woodworking. See ya.